Thank you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Jane Van Buren of Noonmark Services. She is the Executive Director of Women Helping Battered Women, which is a community-based nonprofit organization based in Burlington, Vermont. She is an adjunct faculty member at UVM, teaching courses in the MPA program, and runs a nonprofit management consulting business called Noonmark Services. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So, Jeff, oh, I can do that, can I? You going to bring me back to the beginning, Jeff? Oh, okay. Whoops. There. So thank you all for joining us today. We have a small group, which is actually quite nice because we'll have enough time for you to ask questions, and you don't have to worry about that. Just any time during this presentation, just type in your question in the chat box and I can reply. As Jeff said, I am an instructor at UVM's Master in Public Administration program. I teach classes on nonprofit administration, nonprofit fund development, and women leadership and power. So I've been doing that for the last 7 years. As well, I've been the executive director of nonprofits. Currently, I'm the executive director, as you see, of Women Helping Battered Women, which is a domestic violence service agency in Vermont. And then I also have been running this small little consulting business called Noonmark Services since 2006. And I've been working with nonprofits both in Vermont as well as internationally, mainly on board governance and organizational development. I do a smattering of other things too, like incorporation and fundraising and that type of thing. So that's who I am, and I included this photograph of me with Dr. Phil, not to drop names, but because I thought we all think of him as a leader, or many people in this country think of him as a leader, and also think of him as upholding a lot of ethical standards about behavior and how people should be interacting with one another in the world. So I thought that it would be appropriate. We were both testifying in front of the Senate this past summer on the Violence Against Women reauthorization. So that's why that's there. So, right, I'm assuming this is very odd because this is my first webinar, and so I'm sort of talking into this void, but can you please all just let me know that you're hearing me? Just so I know, I'll just ask once. But is everybody on board with me right now? Jeff hears me. Karen hears me. Joan. And where's Denise? Denise. Oh, good. Okay, good. So, thanks, Jeff. So this is our maiden voyage for Jeff and myself to doing a webinar. So you'll have to excuse us if we make a few stumbles and aren't quite as smooth as we will be the next time around. But thank you for being a small group. Now I'd like you to put a check mark next to your name if you are in a leadership position right now. Oh, good. Okay, that's great. So we'll all be basically on the same page. I'm assuming all of you, Jeff, can you clear out those checks? I want to ask one more question. Do all of you supervise employees? Just check if you do. Okay, that's fine. So that's good. So now I've got a good sense of who's in the room. That's great. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about over the next hour, 50 minutes to an hour, is what do we mean by ethical leadership, and why should we be concerned with the nonprofit sector, and then 6 steps to creating an ethical culture in any organization. So we'll go through each of these in, oh, okay, Joan, I see that you supervise volunteers, great. We'll go over each of these in this next hour. So what is ethical leadership? So I just looked these up in the dictionary, and as you know, ethics is principles, values, beliefs, and defining what is right and what is wrong behavior. And sometimes people call these, the values you learn or the ethics you learn when you're growing up, and it is important as you move into organizational life that your personal ethics match the ethics of the organization. Leadership, the process of influencing others to achieve goals. And the leader, someone who can influence others and has managerial authority. So many people are leaders, and the 3 of us or the 5 of us in this room can consider ourselves among them. All organizations, regardless of what kind of an organization, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, face challenges, can face ethical challenges. Some result in criminal violations, and those are the ones that we hear about in the news all the time, right? Or maybe, hopefully not all the time, but sometimes. Fraud, misappropriation of assets, abuses of expenses, that sort of thing. But in the nonprofit sector, and I guess everywhere, more commonly ethical problems are gray areas. They're sort of in that gray area between, yeah, is this right, is this not right, things that are on the fringes of fraud. In the nonprofit sector, we talk about conflict of interest, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Misallocation of resources. So it's not exactly a misappropriation, but you're allocating them perhaps not in the best practice or not where it should be, or you're sort of smudging your numbers for grant reports, that kind of thing. Lack of accountability and a lack of transparency. You hear that a lot lately, particularly in the nonprofit sector, but also in the for-profit sector. So I wanted to now use the chat box and ask you if what it means to you. What does ethical leadership mean to you? What drew you to this webinar? So just chat a few sentences or one sentence or whatever you want, just to get a sense of what it means to each of you. Anybody have anything? There you go. Yes, I agree. Honesty and integrity within and outside the organization. Doing what is morally right. And sometimes that's what we don't, it's confusing to know what is morally right sometimes. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. And leading by example to accomplish a mission. Great. These are all things that we're going to be talking about. So good to know we're on the same page. And Joan, your comment about honesty and integrity within and outside is kind of what I was talking about, matching what you believe in with the organization's beliefs. If the organization's ethics and your ethics aren't in alignment, then it's not going to be a very satisfying professional experience for you, and it's going to be full of challenges. Great. Anything else before we move on? Okay. So an example that I could think of actually this happened to me at my organization, but I changed the names here to protect the innocent. Jill, the clothing retailer, donates several boxes of new clothing to your organization, which serves people who are currently homeless. The ethical leader makes sure the clothes are given directly to the clients, and the non-ethical leader picks what she wants for her own personal use and then makes the clothes available to clients. That could be considered, if one wanted to consider it that way, a gray area. Some leaders will say, well, I don't pay my staff very much, or I have volunteers who are working for free. They should be able to go through non-cash donated items and take what they want, as part of a perk of the job. Other leaders would say, no, these clothes came in for clients. They came in for people who don't have clothes, therefore it should go directly to the clients. So that's just one example. Then another example that I thought of, and please feel free to interrupt with any questions at any time, but many of us in the nonprofit sector have organizational values that are communication and transparency. You hear those words all the time. We need to be clear in our communication. We need to be transparent with what we're doing. And an ethical leader will model those values. One way is by treating all staff fairly and equitably and providing staff with the information they need to make decisions. And we find that non-ethical leaders promote workers based on favoritism, not performance, and withhold information from employees. So it's important to remember that even the strongest culture will not be able to counter the impact of employees witnessing leaders acting in non-ethical ways, such as playing favoritisms, which I just said, with promotions, withholding crucial information, stifling dissent, or applying different standards to themselves from other employees. Frequently, not so much in the nonprofit sector, but in the for-profit sector, there'll be a whole separate set of benefits for the CEOs and also the rest of the staff, for instance, which doesn't promote a sense of justice. Some organizations have a policy in place whereby the highest paid person makes not more than X% of the lowest paid. Is anybody familiar with that? Does anybody work in an organization, or have you ever worked in an organization where that's true? I know that Ben & Jerry's, for instance, does that, or used to do that the CEO couldn't make more than, I don't know what the percentage was, but some percentage than the lower person. Anybody have experience with that? No, Joan doesn't. I had never worked in an organization that did that, although I do pay attention to that in my organization when I'm setting salaries, but we don't have policy. Is that the same for everybody else? Are you aware of that when you're looking at salaries and how much more are people making from one another? Yes, very anecdotal. Well, at any rate, leaders should make sure that everyone, including themselves, are fairly and not exorbitantly. Joan says yes, and I think that is a problem in our country now. Yes, I would agree with you completely, Joan. And in the nonprofit sector, we have to be very concerned with fairness and not being exorbitantly compensated. The IRS is very interested in making sure that nonprofit CEOs are reasonably compensated, not exorbitantly compensated. And we will discuss more about that in a bit, more about what's particularly true in the nonprofit sector. Okay. I put in some leaders, and just to get our brains moving in the direction of people that we might recognize as leaders, and this is perhaps dating me a bit. Who can name these leaders? Let's see if any of you, who can type in who all these leaders are? Obviously, Mary Kay is pretty evident. Anybody want to take a guess on everybody else? Gandhi, yep. Eleanor Roosevelt, Kennedy, yep. Steve Jobs, MLK, yep. So the one that we're not getting, which I didn't think we would, is the one on the far right. Ah, you got her. Good, Karen. Good. Angela Merkel. Elizabeth Warren, nope. So these are all, the reason I picked these particular leaders was that they represent the different sectors in society, in our business world, in nonprofit world, and government world. So we have three what I would consider community activists, Gandhi, Roosevelt, and MLK. Two presidential political leaders. Angela Merkel is the Chancellor of Germany, and JFK obviously was a president and senator. And then Mary Kay and Steve Jobs, who are both leaders in the business world. And so what my point in bringing this up is that, again, to reinforce that no matter what sector you're a leader in, you're faced with ethical challenges. And more important to this slide, no matter what kind of a leader you are, all of these people, these 7 people up here, were considered influential leaders. They all had either charisma or were transformational in some way. They were able to motivate people. They had paid attention to individual characteristics of their employees. They were really influential in shaping the way people worked. And yet, some of them, which we know from history and from reading, had some challenges with ethics as well. So it doesn't escape, even if you're influential and charismatic and the best transformational leader that ever lived, you are still faced with ethical challenges. Everybody faces the same issues. Okay, moving on. And here's another one. So here's Bill Clinton, whom I just happened to see. I was at a conference recently in DC, and he was at a meeting down the hall and came in and talked to us, so that was pretty exciting. But I thought, what a great slide for this webinar, because he was a very influential leader, very charismatic. He still is very charismatic, very transformational, and yet, he set the moral tone for his administration that many of us have been read about, and obviously with the whole Monica Lewinsky challenges. So leaders, just to repeat that, set the moral tone for the entire organization. We must have commitment from the top management to behave ethically. And leaders are the ones who uphold the shared value of the organization and set the cultural tone. So obviously we're all very different, and people vary in their capacity for moral judgment and in their ability to even recognize when something is a moral issue and to analyze it appropriately. We all vary in what we prioritize in terms of moral issues and moral values. And we differ in our capacity for moral behavior, in our ability to cope with frustration and make good on commitments that we've made. So organizations signal their priorities in multiple ways, including the content and enforcement of their standards. And we're going to talk in a minute about code of ethics. But what the policies, what your personnel policies talk about in terms of your criteria for hiring, how you're going to go about hiring people, what the promotion policy is, compensation policy, and the fairness and respect with which we treat employees. People care very deeply about organizational justice. And all of you, whether you're supervising staff, paid staff, or volunteers, I know can tell me that you've heard people talk about fairness and equity. They want to be treated fairly and with respect, and they know immediately, or they can sense immediately when that's not happening. And so if they think they're being treated well, then they perform better. It's kind of a no-brainer. You know, you treat your people well and they'll perform better. So treating people with dignity, you're rewarded with high ethical conduct. But, and I can't remember who said it, I think it was Karen, that, you know, it is very true that they set the tone for the whole organization. And if you're taking a cue from your leader that organizational justice, yes, I did say organizational justice. So do you want to know what I meant by that? You know, justice and equity within the organization. So is the organization treating everyone fairly? Is it working with community partners in a way that is just and respectful? And once that stops happening, things are going to start unwinding or devolving in the organization because moral cues will be compromised. Does that answer your question, Karen? So it's based on organization's policy. It is reinforced in organization policy. I think that the point I'm trying to make on this slide is that the leaders set the moral tone. A leader will make sure that policy reflects the values and the moral values of equity and justice in the organization. So your personnel policies, for instance, should talk about how you hire and promote people so that it's transparent and clear. Does that help? You are welcome. So here's Bill. We're going to say goodbye to Bill Clinton, but we'll be talking all through the whole rest of this about the leaders that set the moral tone for the entire organization. And the next slide is about the nonprofit sector. We're going to move into now about ethics and creating an ethical code of ethics in an organization. So I picked out a bunch of different logos for nonprofits, and I want to say right up front that I'm not making any judgments one way or the other about the ethical behavior in these organizations. I did pick them out for a purpose, though. I don't think you're all from Vermont. Some of these are Vermont. Some of these are national. And the reason I included some of them is because there's been some questionable ethical practices in 3 of these nonprofits. So the first one I want to talk about is the United Way, the National United Way. And this happened 20 years ago, so it's not very current, or even more than 20 years ago. But in the early 90s, I guess that was 20 years ago, the CEO resigned, and he was later found guilty of fraud and financial mismanagement, and he was convicted and sent to jail. Now, the United Way I don't think that when we think of the United Way, I'm not sure that we think, oh, they're a corrupt organization. Does anybody think that? No. But I think in the early 90s, they were all over the news. And it's taken a while for them to build back their reputation. And now I think we all think of them as a highly ethical organization. The Smithsonian, that was more recently in the news. And this is a clear example of poor moral tone being set from the top. The CEO of the Smithsonian resigned in 2007 because there was a scandal that started coming out. And one of the things that was discovered is that his name was Lawrence Small, took nearly 10 weeks of vacation a year. He was absent from his job 400 work days, and he earned $5.7 million outside of the Smithsonian, mainly serving on corporate boards. It was also discovered that he abused his expense accounts, was charged over $90,000 in travel expenses for his spouse, among other abuses. Congress looked into this because the Smithsonian is a government institution. And so Congress concluded that he had created an imperialistic and insular culture that discouraged dissent, kept secrets, and limited the flow of information to the board of directors, whose job it was, of course, to hire and fire him. Now, from the top, this trickled down. Within days, the Smithsonian's second-ranking official, Sheila Burke, resigned because it was discovered that she was absent from her job for 550 days and earned $10 million over 6 years on non-museum work. And then in 2008, the head of the Smithsonian Latino Center resigned after an internal investigation found out that she had violated a variety of different rules and ethics, trying to get free tickets to things, tickets to concerts and music award ceremonies, abused her expense report, tried to steer contracts to friends, all of that sort of thing. And so the Smithsonian is still reeling from that ethics scandal. And then finally, the American Red Cross, which I think we're probably all familiar with for all of the good work that they do, but also because after 9/11 and after Katrina, there was considerable outcry about how they allocated their resources to help the survivors of both of those disasters. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But what I'm curious about is, having gone through these ethical lapses in judgment, shall we say, in some of these nonprofit organizations, why are we concerned? Do you think that if this had happened in the for-profit sector, we would be so concerned? I know that with Enron, for instance, there was some pretty egregious accounting and the violations with the retirement funds. But are we concerned if a CEO who's making $2 million a year in the for-profit sector has $90,000 in expense accounts to ferry their wife around on planes? What do you think? What do you mean, Joan? Because now it's gotten so excessive? There you go, Karen. We're getting into that next. Yep. We don't know who is doing it. Right. It doesn't hit the news as much, does it? Because it's not it doesn't raise as many eyebrows. Okay, so then why are we concerned about all of this in the nonprofit sector? And Karen is absolutely right. Nonprofits operate within the public support, and they need to grow and maintain the public's trust. Nonprofits don't pay income tax on the revenues they earn, so they are indirectly supported by all taxpayers, who are, of course, the public. Nonprofits seek financial support from the government and private foundations in the form of grants, and they ask community members and corporations for donations. So therefore, nonprofits must maintain a high standard of transparency and integrity if they hope to maintain the support of the community. So this is the big difference about the nonprofit sector. We rely on the public trust in order to survive. In 2008, a Brookings Institute survey found that about 1/3 of Americans reported having not too much or no confidence in charitable organizations. 70% felt that charitable organizations waste a great deal or a fair amount of money. 10% thought charitable organizations did a very good job spending money wisely. Only 10%. Only 17% thought that charities did a very good job of being fair in decisions. And only 1/4 thought that charities did a very good job of helping people. I mean, this is sort of, this is really alarming, actually, when you think about nonprofits, because what we do, supposedly, and I think that we do, is that we are supposed to be spending our money wisely and helping people who need help. A 2006 Harris poll found that only 1 in 10 Americans strongly believe that charities are honest and ethical in their use of donated funds. Nearly 1 in 3 believe that nonprofits have, quote, pretty seriously gotten off in the wrong direction. So these public perceptions are pretty troubling for nonprofit organizations because we count on them for financial contributions. So what can nonprofits do if this public perception is so against the leadership and the accountability of the organizations? I think I have a Can you think, so what, can you think of any other reasons that the nonprofit sector should be concerned with ethical leadership, besides what we've already talked about? Yep. We are very reliant on the public for support. Not only that, but as you know, as nonprofits have grown pretty exponentially in the last 50 years in this country, we also are relying on the public for clients, right? There's a lot more competition than there used to be in the nonprofit sector. And if you're the YMCA, for instance, you're competing with for-profit health clinics, and if you're, gyms. And if you're a theater, a nonprofit theater, you're competing for audience members. Museums compete for audiences. And absolutely, poor behavior makes those connected with it look bad. So if there is even the hint of ethical mismanagement or financial fraud or conflict of interest, it jeopardizes your ability to compete. Okay, so you ready to move on? So the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which if any of you know of this, I think it's a pretty fabulous publication from Stanford in California. You might want to look online, and this is where I got these lists of 6 areas where ethical issues arise in the nonprofit sector, and we're going to go through these pretty carefully. And then from there move into ways that you can create an ethical culture in your organization. So the first one is compensation. And what they're talking about in compensation is what we've talked about already, but just to reinforce that salaries that are modest by business standards can cause outrage in the nonprofit sector, right? I mean, we think that earning 6 figures in the nonprofit sector is the exception. It's not the exception in the for-profit sector. So we have to make sure that we are paying people appropriately and not exorbitantly in the nonprofit sector. And of course, you know, as all of you probably know, that the majority of nonprofits in this country have budgets of less than $500,000, so they're not going to be paying people exorbitantly. But it's the large ones and it's the few bad apples that cause us all to be concerned about this. Conflict of interest. Conflicts of interest tend to arise in the nonprofit sector because of the way that we're structured. The very nature of nonprofit governance, for instance, may cause conflicts to arise more frequently. When you think about who's on the board are community members, many of whom are private business people. And that leads to a number of ethical questions. Should the board members be allowed to obtain contracts for their company? Should, if the board members disclose that they have financial interests in different companies, is that enough? Is it enough if they abstain from voting? Should a major donor receive special privileges? That's an area that has received attention recently. Say someone gives $1 million to a university, do they then get to have a say on the majors of the programs, or who gets to sit on the board of trustees, that sort of thing? How much of a voice does a major donor have? So in order to maintain this public trust and to satisfy fiduciary obligations, really nonprofits should come up with a detailed, unambiguous conflict of interest policy, including requirements that employees and board members disclose all financial interests in the companies that may engage in transactions with the organization. So please stop me if you don't understand anything that I'm saying. But at a minimum, these policies should also demand total transparency about the existence of potential conflicts and the process by which they are dealt with. So your conflict of interest policy should not only say these are the guidelines that we're going to follow to make sure we don't have any conflict, but they also should address, if a conflict does arise, this is what we're going to do to address it. These are the steps we're going to take. Okay. The next bullet is publications and donor solicitation. And what this is referring to is that nonprofits need to be clear and transparent in all publications and in all solicitation of funds about the percentage that is spent on administration. That the Red Cross learned that lesson the hard way this was after 9/11, when they disclosed that they used, it was disclosed that a lot of the donations that they came in were set aside. Donors believed that their contributions would go to help directly the victims and their families. The Red Cross, however, set aside more than half of the $564 million it got after 9/11 for other operations and for future reserves. This was a long-standing organizational practice at the Red Cross, but it wasn't well known. People didn't know about it. And so then there was this donor outrage, which forced the Red Cross to make a public apology and redirect its fund, and their image was tarnished. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but nonprofits need to be very clear about where their money is going, and can sometimes really shoot themselves in the foot if they say that 100% of the funds received are going to go to program when you can't run program without administration. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's something to keep in mind. Transparency is also necessary in solicitation materials, grant proposals, and donor agreements. You can't afford to raise funds on the basis of misguided assumptions or to violate the public's trust in the expectation of resources. Any questions? Okay, financial integrity. Nonprofit organizations face ethical dilemmas in deciding whether to accept donations that have any questionable associations or conditions. This is something that there's no real easy answer to, but should an organization that works with people who are affected by cancer, for example, take money from a tobacco company? Or should a women's studies program take money from Playboy? People are on both sides of this issue. Some people say, tobacco is the reason we're even in business with cancer, and so we should be taking their money to help find a cure. That's the argument. I used to be on the board of an AIDS service organization, and we would argue about whether we should take money from pharmaceutical companies. And that's an example of sort of the ethics of your own personal values and your own personal ethics, and whether or not they can agree with the ethics of the organization and the philosophy of the organization. So there's no easy resolution to that, but there are better and worse ways of addressing them. So appearance matters, and I think that Denise was saying that even if nobody did anything wrong, or if it appears that something's wrong, then that makes a difference to public trust. So it sometimes makes sense to avoid affiliations where questions may arise or where the intention of the donor is less than philanthropic. So those are something that leaders and board members need to think about when they look at their donation mix. So investment policies. These are, people who are advocates of socially responsible investing argue that nonprofit organizations should make sure that their financial portfolio is consistent with their values. And we at University of Vermont are facing this right now because the money with the Rush Limbaugh, UVM sponsors a radio station show that the same radio station that also airs Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh, of course, was just in the news because of his calling that young woman from Georgetown a slut and various other things. And so UVM is grappling with, there's some at UVM who want UVM to pull their investing out of that radio station. Some people who are advocates of socially responsible investing think that organizations should only invest in ventures that are going to further the organization's mission. And in fact, that gained widespread attention. In 2007, there was a Los Angeles Times article that criticized Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for investing in companies that contributed to the environmental and health problems that the foundation is attempting to reduce. So the lesson to take away from that piece is that you have to be careful all the time. You have to look at all the different angles and look at things as a full circle. And then finally, accountability and strategic management. Nonprofits should have a plan for using resources in a principled way. This means developing a well-informed strategic plan. Money that's being held in the public trust should be well spent, not just well-intentioned. So unless you have a good policies in place and a good plans in place, there's too much potential for there to be mismanagement of funds or inefficient or ineffective use of your resources. Okay, any questions about any of that? That was a lot of information from me. Good. Thank you, Karen. All right, and again, I think that Jeff will remind you of this at the end, but this is being taped, so if you want to go back and listen to my gravelly voice again, you can. So now what are we going to do with all this? We know that in the nonprofit sector we have certain, we have considerations that aren't apparent or aren't as evident in the for-profit sector. We know that there are ethical issues that arise in the nonprofit sector that arise differently in the for-profit sector. And so what do you do as a leader? What can leaders do to create an ethical culture? So a strong organizational culture, and I'm assuming you're all familiar with that term, organizational culture, but please stop me if you're not, and we can talk about it. But a strong culture is one that supports high ethical standards and it will have a tremendous influence in the community and on employee behavior, which we've talked about, and we saw at Smithsonian that they did not have high ethical standards, and it backfired on them, right? And although no set of rules or organizational structures can guarantee ethical conduct, nonprofits can take steps that will make it more likely. So the first one is to be a visible role model. And we've talked about this already, but employees take cues about appropriate behavior from those at the top. And I say here that this can be as simple as washing your own coffee cup. And the reason that's even on here is that in preparation for a video I'm putting together about ethical leadership, I interviewed several executive directors in the Burlington area. And they all had very interesting things to say, mostly about some of the things we talked about, aligning their own values, workplace values with organizational values, with personal values. But one of them said, I think about this every time I wash my own coffee cup. And I go into the staff kitchen and I think I have to set an example and I'm washing my own cup, which we all agree we should do, but think of the impact that would have if she didn't. If she left her cup all the time for someone else to wash. So she was saying that this is as simple as washing your own coffee cup. So it's a little simplistic, but I think that's a good point. Employees look to the behavior for benchmarks for defining appropriate behavior. So if she thinks it's appropriate not to wash mine, then I don't need to wash mine either. When senior management is seen as taking the ethical high road, it provides a positive message for all employees. So that's a pretty simple, easy thing to do, wash your cup. Communicate ethical expectations. And then this is when we talk about a code of ethics. Let's see a check. How many of your organizations have code of ethics? No for Denise. Yes for Karen. And yes for Joan. Great. One of the most critical steps, I would argue, that nonprofits can take to promote ethical conduct is to develop adequate ethical codes and effective compliance programs. It should state the organization's primary values and the ethical rules that employees are expected to follow. And I think that these should be part of the employee handbook, part of the board's policies. So employees should be well aware of what's expected of them ethically in an organization. If widely accepted and enforced, codes can also reinforce core values, right? So it's that alignment again. They can deter misconduct, promote trust, and reduce the organization's risk of conflicting interests and legal liability. So that's a pretty key way to be transparent in with your ethical expectations. However, big caveat, the existence of an ethical code does not in and of itself increase the likelihood of ethical conduct. It really depends more on how you've developed the standards, how they're perceived, and how they're integrated into the workplace functions. So as we all know, any policy or any plan runs the danger of not being implemented and sitting on the shelf collecting dust. Same is true of an ethical code. If you don't live it and breathe it and implement it, then institutionalize it, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's not going to do you any good or do you less good. So number 3 is promote effective financial management. So this is the one that gets back to sort of the cause versus the infrastructure versus cause. And one way that nonprofits can take, one step that we can take to be to foster ethical behavior is really to use resources in a socially responsible way. And that doesn't mean green investing in this context. It means more being responsible about how we're spending the money and being transparent and letting the public know, right? And being always aware of the sustainability of our organization. So I think you're probably all familiar with charity watchdog groups like Charity Navigator, and I don't know, Wise Giving is another one. And I have a lot of concerns about those types of organizations or places where people can go to see if you're an organization they should give money to, because they rate nonprofits on the percentage of funds that go to administration rather than to program. And I think that, I think that's responding to real concerns on the behalf of the donating public, but I also think it reinforces the wrong performance measures. It distorts the organization's priorities, and it encourages disingenuous accounting practices. So what do I mean by that? I'll get into that in just a sec, but really what people ought to be looking at is how cost effective is the organization? How are they spending their money? What are the results that they're getting? And most people expect that 100% of their donation will go to funding program activity, but that is at the expense of building long-term institutional capacity. And that's what I mean about disingenuous accounting practices, is that you start spreading your money in different ways, right? You start allocating fundraising, management, and advertising expenses to program rather than to administrative categories. So if everything is going to the cause or to the program, that means the organization is not investing in infrastructure or fundraising capacity. And so, they may have programs that are built on shaky infrastructure. And when that infrastructure starts to crumble, which it will, then everything goes down the tubes with it. So penalizing organizations for having infrastructure investments or higher administrative costs is really misguided, in my opinion, and it encourages sort of aggressive accounting practices. So what do you do with that? I think that nonprofit organizations need to be better about educating the public, about why they have to pay for fundraising costs and why they need to pay for administration. They need to be more transparent and more inclusive and more willing to share performance measures. So ensuring common standards for accounting and developing better rating systems for organizational effectiveness should be a priority. So it's reframing the issue. This is how we can define our effectiveness. And it doesn't mean that we've slashed our administrative costs. It means instead that we've looked at the entire picture of the organization. We've looked at administrative expenses and program expenses, and we've made socially responsible investments in our organization to make sure that we are sustainable and that we're spending donor dollars wisely. So just to finish, I think that organizations that claim that they're giving 100% of their donor dollars to the programs are setting themselves up for an ethical dilemma. And again, I would be concerned if I saw if a nonprofit told me that 100% of my dollar was going to be helping people directly, because I would wonder, how are you running your organization? What's the back room look like? Questions on any of that? Okay, so let's see here. Ethical trainings. This is another one that's relatively easy to do. Provide the trainings, send your people to trainings, seminars, workshops. You can bring people in to talk about it. Use training sessions to reinforce the organization's standards of conduct, to reinforce what practices are acceptable and which are not permissible, and to sort of do a what if. What if you're faced with this potential ethical dilemma? How would you react? What would you do? You can talk about whistleblowing, which we're going to talk about in a second. But how is our organization equipped to handle ethical dilemmas, and these are ways that you can talk about it. So even if you don't bring anyone into the organization from the outside, you as leaders can talk about this in staff meeting, right? What's acceptable in this organization? What are the values of the organization? What are the workplace values? How can we make sure that the way that we treat one another in the organization reflects the values that we want the greater public to see as well? Make sense? Okay, good. So just a couple more here. Let's see. Institutionalize an ethical culture. We've sort of been talking about this a little bit as we go through, but an organization that has a strong ethical culture is when top management leads with integrity, supervisors reinforce ethical conduct, coworkers display a commitment to ethics, and the organization integrates its values in day-to-day decision-making. So it's all about talking the talk and walking the walk, right? Organizations with strong ethical cultures, employees report far less misconduct, feel less pressure to compromise their own ethical values, and are less likely to experience retaliation for whistleblowing. So if you've got it institutionalized, if everybody's on the same page about how the ethics align in the organization, they feel much less pressure to compromise, as well as they feel that nothing bad will happen to them if they talk about an ethical violation. So that this underscores the importance of factoring ethical concerns into all organizational activities, including resource allocation, strategic planning, personnel and compensation decisions, performance evaluation, auditing, communication, and public relations. So this really is what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. How do we move towards an organization where it's just like breathing? The ethical culture of the organization is so institutionalized, so ingrained in what we're doing. But as leaders, we face a host of issues where the moral course of action is by no means self-evident. And I know that we've probably all faced situations where we think, what's the right thing to do here? It's not always clear-cut. And so when there's no consensus about what's appropriate or what you should do, then at least you should have a decision-making process that's transparent and responsive to stakeholders. So if you're faced with an ethical dilemma or an ethical decision in your organization and you don't know what to do, what I'm saying here is that you should at least be transparent about how you reached your decision. I talked to so-and-so and so-and-so. I brought in one of our clients. I brought in a community partner, or I talked to them on the phone. These are the steps I took to make my decision. And then it's not just you as organizational leaders, it's also the board. So board members and nonprofit executives should be willing to ask uncomfortable questions. So not only is this legal, which sometimes is the bottom line, well, can we do it, it's legal or not, but also is it fair? Is it honest? Does it advance societal interests or pose unreasonable risks? And the good question I think to ask is, how would you feel defending it on the evening news? So, if we make this decision and it hits the newspapers, how are we going to feel defending it? Are we going to feel still like it was the right thing, that we can justify from an ethical standpoint? So not only do we need to ask these questions of ourselves, but we need to invite unwelcomed answers from others, which means that we need to we should actively solicit the diverse perspectives, right? We should have diversity in the room. We should be listening to voices that sound different than ours. And dissenting views. So every leader's internal moral compass needs to be checked against external reference points. So you can't surround yourself with people who think like you. You need to surround yourself with people who can have a dissenting point of view, so that you make sure that you're on the right track at all times. Okay, so moving forward, on note to the last point is provide protective mechanisms. And this is pretty straightforward. You need to have whistleblower protection, not only because it's really the right thing to do, but also because of codified. It's Sarbanes-Oxley that you need to have whistleblower protection in your organization. And what this is saying is that your employees need to know for sure that they can talk about ethical dilemmas and report unethical behavior without fear of reprimand. They want to make sure that they aren't going to lose their job if they report something that doesn't look right to them. And one way that you can make sure they do understand that is to consider having someone whose job it is, or part of the job is to be the ombudsman or the ethical counselor in the organization, and somebody that someone can go to. And when I say ombudsman, I mean someone who can investigate complaints and recommend appropriate action, or bring things forward. So those are of these six ways that you can create a more ethical organization. There's some that you can implement right away, and there's some that will take a lot more thinking about and more weighing values and looking at the whole organization in its entirety. But these are 6 steps at any rate, 6 first steps. So I am ready. I've got one more slide to conclude, but are there any comments or questions before I do that? I don't off the top of my head actually, but I do. What I can do is give it to Greg, and I think Greg can probably put something on the website. Yes, he can. Okay. Good to know you're still there, Greg. Jeff. Okay, Jeff. Anybody else? Denise, Joan? Oh, do you do board trainings? Yes, I do board trainings. But, we can talk offline if you're interested in that. But I do an awful lot of work with boards. I find that boards want to do the right thing, and you've got a bunch of well-intentioned people who just sometimes don't know what the path is. And so I do a lot of trainings with boards that help them figure out what their role is, and how they can be sort of the moral leaders of the organization without being in the day-to-day. What are the steps to develop a code of ethics? That's a great question, actually, and I probably should have included some of that in this webinar. Again, let me give something to Greg. I'm sure that Jeff, why am I calling you Greg? Give something to Jeff about some samples, perhaps. Sample code of ethics that might help you get started, and you can see if it's the flavor that fits your organization or not. But beyond that, I think the steps are to talk to your management team and the board and have it be a policy or a code that is not just written by yourself, but really involves a team so you get some buy-in and get different people's perspectives. Does that help? Okay, so, but my last slide is just to conclude, just things that I'm hoping that I pounded enough in this webinar. But as leaders, you set the moral tone for the organization. I think that's pretty clear in everything we've talked about. And regardless of the style of leadership, you can create an ethical culture. Even though the most autocratic leader can have an ethical culture. That's another good question, Joan. I had a slide in here about punishing ethical lapses, and I took it out. I will make sure that I get a sample of that as well. Because I think that that's as important as anything else, is to make sure that you celebrate people who behave ethically and you punish those who do not. That there are some consequences internal to the organization for those who don't act as ethically as they could. So I think that that's a good point, or a good question. And then my third concluding thought is think about the means and the ends. So sometimes we say, well, the ends justify the means, and I think that can be true sometimes. But I think that in nonprofit organizations, and when you're talking about ethical behavior and ethical leadership, you need to think as much about the means as you do about the ends, because sometimes they don't justify the ends, and you need to make sure that you've thought that through when you're faced with any kind of an ethical dilemma, or when you have a decision to make or a course of action that you want to take. Think about the means and the ends. And then finally, I think it all comes down to the golden rule. We want to be treated in the way that we want to treat others in the way that we want to be treated. So, I think particularly when it comes to employees and organizational justice and ethics and respect, it's just treating others in the way that they like to be treated. And that's what I have to say on that. So any final comments from anybody? Thanks, Karen.
Hello, this is Jeff. I'm back again.
Not Greg, right?
This is Jeff this time.
Okay.
So if there's no other questions or comments, I will go to the closing screen. So thank you, Jane. That was an excellent presentation, very informative.